if you think about it, it's a very delicate thing, isn't it? There's so many different types of religion, or what people call religion. When they say spirituality, there are a dozen or more things that people tend to mean. The media, the press, doesn't know exactly what to do with this phenomenon of spirituality or religion. The press seems to know only two people that believe in God. One is George Bush and one is Osama bin Laden. And the press isn't sure which is more dangerous. Those who look into spirituality or religion in just for more than an hour realize that there are at least two very different types of spirituality and religion. And there are many different ways to categorize them. Traditionally, they're referred to as esoteric and exoteric, the inner and outer forms. Another way of looking at it is that some of the forms of religion are clearly pre-rational, magic and mythic. And yet other forms of religion and spirituality are trans-rational. They're deeply, deeply contemplative and move beyond any ordinary categories of reason and logic, but not beneath it. They transcend and include reason. They are not anti-rational. So how indeed to get this kind of conversation going in the modern world, it's very difficult. Because if you look at some of the more dogmatic forms of religion, not that dogma is bad, it has its place. But if you look at these types that we're calling exoteric religion, or religion of myth and dogma, it's arguably the cause of more human suffering and death than any other man-made cause on the face of the planet. And yet, if you look at the great paths of liberation, those contemplative paths that have claimed to show men and women a doorway in the deepest part of their own consciousness to that realm which is timeless and spaceless and beyond death and pain and mortality. So on the one hand, we have religion causing the most human suffering imaginable, and on the other hand, the only path out of human suffering that we know of. How to get that conversation going? Extraordinarily difficult, and yet there arguably is no more important conversation than we can have. It's of course gotten extremely urgent given the fact that so many of the wars that human males are involved in, I was going to say men and women, but that humanity is involved in, really are religious. We're certainly facing this with the what most people in the West refer to as terrorism, and those who are involved in it simply refer to it basically as militant orientation. But we see that in the news now daily. And so how do we deal with that? And what distinctions can we make? How can we say what we need is more spirituality in our lives, when more spirituality causes more suffering and pain than any other thing we know? If we can't come up with some distinctions that make sense and that men and women everywhere can begin to agree on, then simply saying all you need is love, or all you need is God, or all you need is more religion or spirituality might be a prescription for disaster. We are at Integral Spiritual Center, which Father Thomas and I are members, particularly looking at a handful of concepts that help us get a handle on some of these distinctions in spirituality and religion. And indeed, one of them is what we call the pre-trans fallacy, or the pre-post fallacy, the fact that pre-rational engagements and trans-rational engagements are often confused simply because both are non-rational. We're also looking at a concept called the conveyor belt. We'll be glad to talk about that, religion actually is one of the very few human disciplines that seems to span the the entire spectrum of human development, moving from archaic levels or waves of consciousness to magic, to mythic, to rational, to pluralistic, to integral and superintegral. There's no other discipline that really covers that entire spectrum. And yet the evidence now is becoming extremely convincing that men and women have these great levels or stages, waves of consciousness available to them cross-culturally. And that part of what religion in its highest effort can do is help men and women move from the pre-rational forms of religion to the rational forms to the trans-rational. Now, religion does a lot of other things, but there's an enormous amount of evidence that it can do that. Another concept that we find useful is the distinction between stages of development or stages of consciousness and states of consciousness. And we can go into that a little bit. I just mentioned some of the widely accepted stages of human development: archaic to magic, to mythic, to rational, to pluralistic, to integral and higher. But at any of those stages, men and women can have powerful religious experiences. And these states of consciousness can be oriented towards nature, they can be oriented towards deity forms, they can be oriented towards vast formless emptiness. You can have those religious experiences at virtually any stage of development. And so this means that religion or powerful, authentic spirituality is not available merely at the highest stages of development, because you can have these temporary peak experiences at virtually any stage. But what we do find is that you tend to interpret your religious experience according to the stage you're at. So if you're at a magical stage of development and you have an experience of a vast, luminous cloud of love and bliss, an experience of overwhelming compassion, clarity, oneness with everything that's arising, and you're at a magical level, you will tend to interpret it in magical terms. If you're at a mythic level, you'll tend to interpret it in mythic terms. There are many people at rational stages of development that have these experiences, and they interpret them in very rational terms and often try to explain it away. It's just fireworks in the brain. Somebody at the mythic level might interpret it as an encounter with a literal figure, Jesus perhaps, or one of the bodhisattvas, or an angel. If you move into pluralistic stages, typically postmodern interpretations, first you'll try to deconstruct it. If it doesn't go away, you'll say, well, it's true for me, but not necessarily true for you. When you get to the integral stages, which is one of the things that we might want to talk about, psychologists continually find that starting at these stages that many of them call integrated or integral are the first stages that actually attempt to integrate all of the previous stages. One of the definitions of these earlier stages of human development is that each of those stages thinks that their truth is the only truth that's actually correct. And once you get to an integral stage, you realize that all of those truths are appropriate and correct in their own place, in their own time. And so there's an attempt to try to integrate all of these different worldviews and to make room for them. And so that becomes a very, very important aspect in terms of trying to understand men and women's approach to the divine.